Andrew Jackson earned his reputation not as a gentleman philosopher writing declarations of independence and constitutions. Jackson earned his reputation on the battlefield as really a quite ruthless leader of men in battle. He's really the first public figure vying for national office that temperamentally was not a gentleman, but represented instead the lower classes.
Jackson got elected, in a sense, by associating himself and his new party, his new political party, with the Jeffersonian tradition, democracy, states' rights. And so Marshall perceived that Jackson was another threat to the integrity of the Union and, of course, the authority of the Supreme Court.
Andrew Jackson was a man you crossed at your peril. He was an avid and accomplished duelist, having killed 3 men, and he had 1 ball of shot lodged in his chest and 1 in his shoulder, both from duels. Recurring infections required vigilance, making Jackson the only president to ever bleed himself in the White House. Unlike Jefferson, Andrew Jackson wasn't keen to diminish the court's power. He meant to own it. In 2 terms, Jackson would appoint 5 justices to the Supreme Court. 4 were solid states' writers and strong supporters of slavery. The new justices resisted the charming orbit of the chief, choosing to take their own separate Washington City lodgings. The convivial boarding house broke up. Dissents were more frequent. Marshall even found himself looking for room to compromise with the states' rights bloc. There was one notable exception. The Cherokee Indians had lived for nearly 40 years on land they held by treaty with the federal government. Unfortunately, it was in one of the most recalcitrant states in the country, Georgia. When gold was discovered on the Cherokee lands, the Georgia legislature grabbed for it, openly defying the federal treaty.
The state of Georgia is just trying to kick them out and send them to territory which was not their ancestral home, and basically saying, go out there and start over.
President Jackson, an old Indian fighter, was with Georgia. The president, like the U.S. Congress, plainly wanted the Cherokees removed to make way for the white man. And Marshall no longer appeared equal to Jackson's monumental will. As 2 separate Cherokee cases moved through the Supreme Court, woe seemed to pile on the head of the aging Chief Justice. In October of 1831, Marshall underwent bladder surgery without the aid of anesthesia. While he was convalescing at home in Richmond, his wife died. When Marshall returned to the business of the court, he was clearly diminished. A colleague went to Marshall's room one morning and found him weeping. A lawyer flinched when the Chief Justice arrived at the court unshaven, with egg on his face. But when the time came to issue a decision on the final Cherokee case, John Marshall refused to stand down. For the first time in his career, he took on the entire political system, president, Congress, and a state government. Georgia's seizure of Cherokee lands, Marshall found, was illegal.
This may be an apocryphal story, but Jackson said, well, Chief Justice Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it. Knowing full well that Marshall and the brethren aren't going to go out and stop the movement of Native Americans into the interior part of the country. What Jackson knew, and what Marshall knew as well, is that the reach of judicial power extends as far as the executive is willing to enforce it.
There are only a couple of examples in all of the history of our country where presidents did not enforce some relevant applicable decision of the Supreme Court. One was President Andrew Jackson, and the result was disaster for the Cherokee Indians.
Andrew Jackson negotiated action with the Cherokees to send them, in a sense, on this incredible trek west of the Mississippi River, in which thousands of them, men, women, and children, died on the way. And once they got there, of course, they had no land, as it turns out. It was one of the great tragedies, certainly, in American history.
The lingering lesson of the Cherokee cases is that the power of the court is merely the power to persuade, unless the court's decisions are brought to life by the rest of the political system.